Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mary Hartnett, and I'm the Executive Director of Clean Elections Minnesota. Clean Elections Minnesota is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works for an inclusive and healthy democracy. Among our goals are fighting campaign misinformation, expanding voter access, and limiting the power of big and dark money in our political process. Our work to limit the influence of misinformation has led us to look at the potential impact of artificial intelligence on our elections and to consider possible guardrails to protect against its misuse. That's why we, along with the League of Women Voters Minnesota, Common Cause Minnesota, Fair Vote Minnesota, and the Minnesota Humanities Center, are happy to bring you tonight's conversation with Dr. Darrell West. Before introducing Dr. West, I should point out that in its 2023 session, the Minnesota legislature took up the subject of AI in elections for the first time. By a nearly unanimous vote, it made it a crime to deepfake a message within 90 days before an election. Deepfaking is when a video of a person is altered digitally so that they appear to be somebody else. Also, earlier this week, Minnesota's top elections official, Secretary of State Steve Simon, warned a U.S. Senate committee about misinformation and threats from AI. Our guest tonight, Dr. Darrell West, a senior fellow in technology with the Brookings Institution, is a leading American voice on artificial intelligence and elections. He's also co-editor of Tech Tank magazine and website. Dr. West has written over a dozen books and numerous articles on politics and technology. We're both excited and grateful that he will be visiting with us tonight. We're also happy tonight to have Pulitzer Prize-winning veteran journalist and CEM board member Dave Hoggy interviewing Dr. West. Thanks to both of you. Dave?
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. If you're like me, you're a little overwhelmed by this tidal wave of news coverage about artificial intelligence that we've seen in the last few months, and you may be wondering, is this a peril to the future of human civilization? Or could artificial intelligence actually help us along? And fundamentally, what the heck is it anyway, and how does it work? We're going to plunge into those topics tonight with Dr. Darrell West. So let me begin with a bit of a primer. Dr. West, could you give us a simple definition of artificial intelligence and where it came from?
Well, thank you, Dave. It's nice to be with you. And I want to thank Mary, Connie Lewis, and Ken Peterson for helping to set up this event, and definitely applaud all the groups who are active in this. Appreciate your interest in the upcoming election. So on your question of what is AI, AI refers to automated algorithms that analyze data, text, and images and can make recommendations based on that information. And key is the ability to learn as the algorithms process more data, more video, more images, more anything. It gets better at making recommendations. Now, more recently, over the last few months, there has been a new type of AI that has come on the scene called generative AI, which is based on large language models that process even greater amounts of information and do even more sophisticated things. And the key thing there is what generative AI has done is really democratize technology, in the sense that in the past, in order to use sophisticated algorithms, you needed a pretty advanced technical background. You needed to, understand coding and needed to kind of know your way around algorithms. The new generative AI tools are prompt-driven and template-driven, which basically means anybody can use them. You don't need a computer background. You don't need to be a technical expert. Literally anybody can feed questions, inquiries, and prompts into the software and get very sophisticated answers back. And so that creates good possibilities, like there are good uses of this type of technology. But as the introduction pointed out, there also are a lot of worrisome things that we will talk about tonight.
Quick digression. I first encountered artificial intelligence some months ago. We were visiting friends, and their college-age son pulled it up on his iPhone, and I think asked AI to write a Shakespearean sonnet. for us. We were just standing in the kitchen, and of course, here came the sonnet. We were all astonished. We were flabbergasted, and we sort of broke out laughing. How many people are using it? Are there hundreds and thousands of young people or not so young people who are actually using it day to day, week to week?
I mean, there are millions of people using it. The adoption curve has been very steep. Lots of people have been interested in this. OpenAI was kind of the first mover in this area and got a lot of attention, but virtually every other company has now developed other examples of this. So there are thousands of different examples of this type of technology on the market. And what has happened is the early versions were pretty general purpose, but as companies have developed their various capabilities, they now have developed very precise things that can do specific tasks. So, if you're in the banking area and you need to use AI to help inform lending decisions, like there is generative AI that can do that. If you're in higher education and you want to use AI to manage your yields and make sure you know how many students are going to show up on the first day of classes, there are tools that can do that. So the sophistication and the breadth of things that the new AI tools can do is really astonishing, and they're being deployed in virtually every sector.
Amazing. You've written op-eds for the Washington Post and a number of other great publications about some of the potential risks of artificial intelligence in political communication. Could you give us one or two examples, recent examples, in which artificial intelligence was used in troubling ways in political communication?
Well, we're already seeing AI being used to generate the deep fakes that Mary mentioned in her opening remarks, and the state of Minnesota already has passed legislation to try and reduce or eliminate the nefarious uses of that. So, for example, Trump, following one of his indictments, like I saw things on social media, videos of him being dragged away by the police. Those videos never took place. That did not happen, but the videos look completely authentic. Trump supporters probably saw that as outrageous, that their preferred candidate was being mistreated in such a nefarious way. There have been other examples, like abroad, President Zelensky of Ukraine has been appearing in videos surrendering to Russia, stealing money, like doing all sorts of terrible things. And so when you think about the upcoming election, just the high degree of polarization we face, the radicalization, the extremism that we're seeing, you can imagine all sorts of videos, audio tapes, and other things showing candidates saying and doing things they did not actually do. So, for example, Republicans are accusing the Biden family of kind of profiting from various Chinese business deals. I am sure there are going to be videotapes and audio tapes showing Joe Biden talking with Chinese officials and saying, hey, send me the $1 million to this particular account. And as of now, that didn't happen. We don't know that there's actually evidence to support that, but they're going to be videotapes and audio tapes looking completely authentic. And the challenge is going to be, how are voters going to respond? How are people going to protect themselves? Is this going to be an election that ends up being decided based on disinformation?
I read about a recent example in which the DeSantis campaign took something that Donald Trump had posted on his social media account in writing, and they used AI to fake Trump's voice and then posted it as if former President Trump had said these words and sent that out. Is that an example of using AI in a bad way? And how bad is that? They were his words. And how dangerous is that?
I mean, that is at the more benign end of the spectrum, in the sense that Trump actually said some of the things. DeSantis was not kind of making stuff up and having him say things that he didn't believe or that he didn't do. So, it's bothersome that there's kind of fake stuff like that that's appearing, but it's still rather authentic in the sense of what Trump says on those tapes is pretty much what he actually believes. What we're going to see, though, are much more nefarious uses where candidates are saying and doing things that they didn't actually do, that they don't believe. There's going to be guilt by association. There have been images that some of the Republican candidates have circulated of Donald Trump hugging Anthony Fauci, the medical doctor who's kind of radioactive in conservative circles because they didn't like his position on the pandemic. That hug never took place. Donald Trump, to my knowledge, has never hugged Fauci. But, that's the type of stuff that is much more worrisome because it's basically putting candidates in position or having them say things that they didn't actually say. That then moves from information to misinformation and disinformation.
Wow. I want to move in a moment to what the government could do to regulate this sort of thing. But for now, let me ask, so what can those of us sitting at home do? Is there anything we can do as voters, as citizens, to tell when we've received misinformation, disinformation that was generated in this fashion, to tell fact from fiction, as it were?
It is going to be a hard upcoming year for everybody, regular people, voters, even technical experts, because the new AI tools generate text and images and audio that look and sound completely authentic. So, for example, there's AI that could mimic the voice of your mother or your grandmother or a brother and sister, call you up, deliver certain messages, and it's going to sound just like your mother or your grandmother. And so the potential for deception, manipulation, and outright fraud is going to be very high. And consumers should be aware that criminals, of course, are already figuring out how to use these tools. And so the risk to consumers is going to be very high. People need to have their guard up about fraud, not just in the election area, but fraud in finance and marketing and all sorts of other things. It's going to be hard to distinguish the real from the fake because it used to be in the era of photoshopping where, we would kind of Photoshop and put somebody's head on somebody else's body. It always looked kind of amateurish. And, if you looked at it carefully, you could say, hey, that's clearly not that person's head on that individual's body. That is no longer going to be the case. Like the new tools are going to generate images that look completely real. So you can look at them, you're not going to be able to tell the real thing from the fake thing. So at a minimum, we actually need to start having disclosure requirements, whether it's in the election area or in the consumer area, just to let people know when they are seeing images, audio tapes, and videotapes that are generated by AI. So at least then people have an ability to kind of look at that message with a little bit more skepticism, subject that message to common sense, think about ways you could fact check the information that is presented there. But if there's no disclosure requirements, people are going to end up getting bombarded by this stuff, and it is going to be very difficult for them to discern the real from the fake.
Wow. I would like to move on. You've raised the topic of disclosure. I'd like to move on to the question of regulating and forcing disclosure. Before I do that, let me just pause to remind our audience that we'll be taking questions from the audience later in the hour. You can enter your questions on the Zoom website in front of you. And in the last 15 or 20 minutes of our conversation tonight, we'll go to those questions from the audience. So, we've talked about some of the risks, some of the potential damage. Are there constructive ways that Congress or state legislatures can regulate the use of artificial intelligence and prevent these nefarious uses without running afoul of the First Amendment and free speech protections?
Well, the short answer to your question is yes, and I will enumerate a number of different things that we can do, but I want to put it in the context of, when I give talks to various audiences, I find that what people fear about many of the emerging technologies is just the loss of human agency. Like people worry that the technology is so advanced and so sophisticated that it is becoming outside of our control. What I want to tell people is that is not the case. When you look at the history of technology, there have been new innovations that have come along over a number of different centuries. They start to become popular. They start to be misused. What happens, and it takes a while to get to this point, but we start to legislate and we start to regulate the nefarious uses. So we're kind of in the early phases of that. But, similar to the advent of television, people worried about the potential of television to manipulate people, would it kind of feed people information that would turn their brain to jelly? We started to we started to regulate the early days of television to try and deal with some of the more nefarious uses of that. And the same thing is going to happen in the area of digital technology. And you mentioned the Minnesota legislature already has passed a legislation kind of making it illegal to use sex in a way to put somebody's head on a naked body in order to embarrass them. That will be illegal under this legislation. In the 90 days before an election, using AI to distort the election or mislead people in certain respects. That is a type of thing that we need to think about. And it's easier than a lot of people imagine. I was on a television interview show this morning and people kept talking about, oh, it's really complicated. How can we regulate all these new technologies? All we need to do is there are many laws already on the books for the physical world where we basically have outlawed illegal behavior. We penalize illegal behavior. We just need to start taking those protections that already exist in the physical world and import it into the digital world. So, for example, we need to start auditing algorithms to see how they perform. Are they producing biased results, misleading results, or fraudulent results? Algorithms can be audited to see how they're performing and what types of recommendations they are making. We can have licensing requirements. In America, we require licenses for all sorts of things. To get married, you need to have a marriage license. To start a business, you need a business license. To drive a car, you need a driver's license. We need to start thinking about licensing requirements for large-scale algorithms that affect 1 million people or more. So we're not talking about small-scale algorithms or mom-and-pop businesses that are, experimenting with different software and trying to figure out how to improve their business operations. We're talking about algorithms that affect large numbers of people and have the ability to harm people in the employment area, in the housing area, or in other types of areas. So there are licensing requirements where basically people have to demonstrate their expertise to put these types of algorithms on the market. We need to start holding the algorithm developers more accountable. There needs to be more transparency about how the algorithms make decisions. I mean, there could be millions or billions of parameters in these algorithms. How are we weighting the information? On what kind of data were these algorithms trained? Because that actually tells us a lot about the potential negative consequences that can come out of it. So there are lots of different things that we can do. And the message that I like to remind people is don't feel helpless. Even though the technologies are complicated and they seem like it's too complicated to regulate, they're not. There are lots of people with the expertise to understand how the algorithms operate, what can go wrong, how they can be misused, and therefore how we need to legislate to deal with the nefarious uses.
Great, thank you. So this question may sound a bit simple-minded, but what if someone transmits a message using artificial intelligence, it's misleading, it's dishonest, and then they simply say, it was a joke, I was just kidding, I didn't mean any harm, or even say, it was just communication, and I have a First Amendment right to say this or to create this message and send it out. How do we get at that?
Well, if a bank robber goes into a bank and says, I want all of your money, and then the police catch him and he says, oh, excuse me, I was just joking, nobody's going to believe that kind of defense. So I don't think we need to worry about that. The more serious problem that is going to pop up is the question of intent. a lot of our laws on illegal behavior kind of refer not just to bad behavior, but the intent to commit illegal actions. Now, with human beings, it's easier to prove intent in the sense that you can interview the person, interview the associates of the person, look at past actions and infer intent. You know, we can kind of get a handle on that when it's a human who's making a decision. The question is, when an algorithm makes a decision, how do we deal with this question of intent? Like, where is the intent to manipulate the election? Where is the intent to commit fraud? That is actually, I think, one of the bigger challenges in terms of dealing with illegal behavior or unethical behavior. How do you prove intent in regard to an algorithm?
Right. Wow. We're already getting good questions in from the audience, and I want to move to one of those in a minute. But first, let me just sort of close the loop on this issue of regulation. A number of states have either passed or are considering disclosure requirements. If you're using artificial intelligence in a political message, or if it has been used, you have to disclose that fact. Does that seem, number one, like it'll be effective? And number two, I mean, can you enforce it? And is disclosure sufficient?
Disclosure definitely is help, and I definitely recommend that we move in that direction. But as your question suggests, it doesn't deal with the impact. Like, you could have a candidate or a party organization basically tell people, yeah, we used AI to generate this message, but it still could have very negative consequences on the election process. So the disclosure does not address the harm that comes out of this. And so we also need to think about legislating in areas where there are overt harms. And the freedom of speech argument is something that we need to think about. And obviously, we all support freedom of speech. It's in the Constitution. It's an important right in the United States. But in the United States, we've never had an unlimited right to freedom of speech. You know, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater because we know that physical harm comes out of that. And so in the digital world, there are things that people can say and do that lead to harm. And so we cannot use a freedom of speech argument to say, oh, we can't legislate in this area. You know, if someone is engaging in online behavior that is hate speech or inciting violence or perpetuating consumer fraud, we shouldn't allow them to use freedom of speech as a justification for those actions and as an excuse not to legislate in those areas.
Right. Wow. Well, that's very helpful. At the same time, it seems to me this gets a bit tricky. The question of intent, and it came up in a recent national example, which I won't cite particularly, but what if the person who's used artificial intelligence has transmitted a message that is incorrect and is potentially damaging, and the person says, but I believed it to be true at the time that I sent it out. I thought that was true. I may be wrong. It may have hurt people, but I really believe that that was true. Is there a way to get at that?
Well, in the non-digital world, you know, people often make those types of defenses, and it really comes down to the facts and circumstances. And, you know, you can interview people and find out, you know, was there a systematic pattern of transmitting information? Like, you know, that's one thing if you transmit one rumor and it turns out to be inaccurate. But if there's a systematic pattern where you've sent out 1,000 messages and they all have information in it that is inaccurate, like, that's a different legal situation, and the person is not likely going to be able to get by with that type of defense. So again, you know, a lot of these issues we've actually worked out in our jurisprudence in the non-digital area, and we need to start transmitting those same principles to the digital world.
Right. All right, great. I'd like to go to a question from the audience right now. As you said a moment ago, human beings, we've been dealing with new technological breakthroughs, new inventions for decades and centuries. And many of them have turned out to be salubrious and productive. where they weren't, we figured out ways to regulate them and turn them to a better use. So we have someone from the audience asking, and it's a great question because we've dwelled on the potential damage. Someone asking, are there constructive uses for artificial intelligence, and in particular, constructive uses that could give us a better politics?
The short answer to there also is a yes, in the sense that most technologies are what we call dual use technologies that can be used for good or ill. And it comes down to the intent and the motivation of the individual and how they want to use it. But there are many good uses of AI for communications and marketing. And I'm sure there are people in your audience who probably already are using it, either in a political world or in a marketing world. The good news about the new AI tools, we mentioned that basically they have democratized the technology. And what that means in practice is you no longer need a large staff or a big budget to engage in political persuasion. Basically, the new tools have brought very powerful communications tools down to the ordinary individual. And so for people in these groups who are watching this event today, or other groups across the country who feel strongly about the election, whether they're Republican or Democrat, liberal, moderate, conservative, or libertarian, these new tools are going to allow them to participate in the election, to communicate about the election, to try and persuade their friends and neighbors. All of that is good. Like, I'm a political scientist by training. I like elections with a lot of voter engagement and large voter turnout. Like in 2020, we had about 2/3 of Americans participate in the presidential election. That was our largest voter turnout in almost a century. I thought that was great. In 2024, I want to see the same thing, if not more people participating. And so these new communications tools are going to allow people with small staffs and modest budgets to actually engage in contesting the election. And I encourage people to do that, regardless of your political perspective.
Fantastic. Do we know of examples of that happening already, where individuals or small, under-resourced organizations have found constructive ways to use artificial intelligence in, gee whiz, voter outreach or political messaging?
It's being used in all of the ways in which campaigns engage in outreach. So you can think about advertising appeals, direct mail campaigns, e-blasts, text messages, like how you come up with a message that's going to resonate with people. Generative AI can actually help people do that. Like, you can put in a request, say, you want to target particular kinds of voters. What is a message that might be persuasive with that particular group? And it will generate some possibilities. And of course, you as the human have to evaluate those possibilities. You still need to use your human judgment. It may generate some ideas that don't make any sense at all, but it may generate some good ideas. So in all the ways in which groups try and contest elections now, generative AI can be helpful. It's relatively low cost. Basically every individual in every group is now the equivalent of $1 million organization in terms of its communications capability. People should take advantage of that.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to switch to a slightly different topic, a slightly different arena for the use of artificial intelligence. The political analyst Sarah Bender has written about the use of algorithms to update voter rolls in the states. And as we've learned, updating those voter registration rolls periodically is an extremely important task for state election officials. It's also a process that is, fraught with some risks of manipulation. It's obvious it's an extremely complicated process, thousands or millions of voters, millions of pieces of information. And she's written that artificial intelligence could be a powerful tool to help state elections officials update and validate their voter lists. At the same time, artificial intelligence, I mean, it seems like almost a natural use of it, could be used to skew those voter rolls, to identify certain voters or groups of voters that a political organization might favor or might not favor. Is there a risk? Are there even examples already of elections officials using artificial intelligence to skew voter rolls, to disenfranchise certain groups, to manipulate the voter list in a way that they like?
Sarah Binder has a great article on this subject in the University of Michigan Law Review. It's online. People can Google that and find it. And she has a very extensive analysis. We also interviewed her, I think, a couple months ago on our Tech Tank podcast, so people could listen to that as well. But basically what she finds is states are actually using AI algorithms in a variety of ways in terms of election administration. There's been a lot more attention paid to the communication side and how people are going to use deep fakes and use AI to generate commercials and all those sorts of things. But she makes a very useful contribution that AI is also being used in election administration. One of the examples she talks about is there actually are states that are using it to quote unquote, clean up their voting rolls. Obviously, we don't want dead people voting, so you can use algorithms to kind of match the list of people who've died versus a list of people who are registered to vote and get rid of the deceased individuals. But there are possible nefarious uses of that very same technology. A lot of states are using what they call name matching algorithms to try and eliminate what they think are duplicate voters. But the problem with those algorithms is, and I've experienced this myself, like sometimes I vote by absentee ballot and you have to kind of sign your name and certify that you're the person. Sometimes I can't remember whether when I registered to vote, I registered as Darrell West or Darrell M. West. And the problem with these name matching algorithms is if I registered as Darrell M. West, but I signed my ballot as Darrell West, that algorithm may kick me off as an illegal voter. And so that's kind of an example of how algorithms are being used. And the potential misuse can be is if they start targeting voters based on names kind of tied to certain minority groups or ethnic groups and trying to get rid of certain types of voters, meaning they're not using the algorithm in a neutral way just to kind of get rid of deceased voters, whether they're Republican or Democrat, but starting to target voters and clean up the rolls in a way that advantage one or the other of the parties. That obviously is something we don't want to see happening. And people need to kind of pay attention what is happening in their states. I'm not sure how Minnesota, the state, is treating this, if they're using algorithms, but people should be checking this out in each of their respective states.
Wow. Well, to pursue that just a bit more, so that if a candidate or a party, for example, wanted to target Latino voters to earn their support, or the opposite, could an algorithm be used to identify names that may sound Hispanic or may sound Latino? Is that a potential risk?
That is both a use and a possible misuse. Candidates target various groups all the time. There's nothing illegal or unethical about doing that. It becomes a problem if they start to target a group in nefarious ways to engage in voter suppression, to put out disinformation designed to get certain types of voters not to vote, because voters of that group tend to vote for a particular party. Then that crosses the line between a useful example of that algorithm to a use that becomes less honest and less straightforward and probably less legal.
Yeah. As we know, campaigns, political consultants, candidates have worked increasingly in recent years to target their messaging. They want to reach a certain group of voters who live in a certain county, or who have voted a certain way in the past, or who have certain issues on which they place a high priority. I've read that algorithms and artificial intelligence may be a powerful tool to identify those target audiences and even fine-tune them down to a very fine gradation. Is there a risk that at some point politicians start ignoring the larger public and focus their messaging, focus their efforts exclusively on extremely small, extremely finely tuned target voter populations that matter a lot to them? And then
we already see that happening. There are examples of micro-targeting, or sometimes I say we move beyond that to what I've referred to in writing as nano-targeting.
Wow.
You can target very small numbers of individual with a specific message designed to either persuade them, to get them to vote, or to try and get them not to vote if you think they're going to vote for the opposition candidate. And if you think about the upcoming election, at least at the presidential level, we know most states are going to be very predictable in terms of whether they're going to go Republican or Democrat. Already election analysts are saying that the real presidential election, because of the Electoral College, is going to come down to half a dozen states, places like Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and there may be a few other states as well. It's a relatively small number of states that are going to decide this election. And if you look at 2020, in some of those states, it may be 50 or 100,000 voters in those states that matter. And so in this very important election, we may end up having the election decided by a few 100,000 voters, which is a very small group of people. AI can help target messages on those individuals. You can identify who those people are and what are the issues that are likely to resonate with them. One of my fears about 2024 at the presidential level is if you look at the current polling on Biden and Trump, if that turns out to be the choice next November, the undecided vote is in the single digits. It varies with a particular survey, but I've seen surveys where the undecided vote between Trump and Biden is down to 7 or 8%. Now, the question is, what is going to move that 7 or 8% one way or another? After 4 years of a Trump presidency, and now 3 years of a Biden presidency, and all the things that we know about both Trump and Biden based on their experience, their governing philosophy, their policy preferences, there still are 7 to 8% of Americans that have not made up their mind. The question is, what is going to move them? And already, the candidates are kind of jockeying to find, what are the messages that are going to do that? Is it Biden family corruption that might move that last 7 or 8%? Is it Trump indictments? Is that going to move people? We could end up with the election being decided on obscure issues or even outright disinformation. There could be false claims that get dumped in the last week or the last month of the election that could decide that last 1%, 2%, or 3% in a handful of states, and that could be decisive in this election.
Wow. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Yeah, we're getting a lot of great questions rolling in from the audience, and I'd like to shift over to those now. And starting with one that was sort of on our list anyway. It's just a great question, and that is, well, it's a two-part question. First, how can individuals, how can organizations like ours, how can communities and nonprofits work together to suppress the use of artificial intelligence for misinformation, disinformation, and to promote the constructive use of it? And part two is, should communities already start working together to inform the public of these risks, of the potential? In other words, what can we do as a community to make sure that artificial intelligence isn't corrupting our elections?
Well, the key thing in each of those questions is kind of a realization: information matters. Information leads to voter persuasion, which leads to how people end up making their decision. And so I think everybody's worried about disinformation. The good news is in Washington, D.C., there actually is bipartisan paranoia that AI is going to be used against either side. Republicans are worried the Democrats are going to do it to them. Democrats are worried the Republicans are going to do it. And this is the reason why eventually there's going to be legislation. Like when both sides are worried about something, then stuff is going to start to move. But in disinformation in particular, there are different ways individuals can operate, organizations can operate, and communities as a whole. One, when there is clear-cut disinformation, people need to address that. They need to identify it as false information. They need to tell people what the facts are in a situation. And I know facts are contested today, and in a period of polarization, it's hard to get people to agree on facts, even if scientific experts and medical experts are promulgating a particular point of view. But we shouldn't give up on that. When there are clearly inaccurate facts, we need to confront that. Secondly, we need to put out accurate information. Like, groups play a role in putting out information. That's actually been the strength of America for a long time. Like, all the voluntary associations, all the groups, all the advocacy groups exist all across the country. They need to realize 2024 is kind of a jump ball for a lot of important issues that people care about: the state of American democracy, the Ukraine war, geopolitics, et cetera, et cetera. The list is very long. This is an election that is really going to matter. Groups need to get involved in, given whatever their particular perspective is, try and put out information that will help inform people, but understand that the election is going to come down to that 8% undecided vote. 92% of Americans have already made up their mind. And I think that's probably true at the presidential election. It may be true in some Senate and gubernatorial elections as well. We need to figure out how to reach that undecided vote, because those are the people who are going to decide these elections.
A moment ago, you mentioned the idea of agreeing on facts, of of making sure that claims and campaigns are based on facts. We're increasingly living in a society that some people have called, the fact-free society, where we have a certain number of people who simply don't care what the truth is or where facts come from. We have a certain number of leaders who don't seem to worry if they're getting their facts wrong, if they are misleading the public, and a period of tremendous suspicion, even paranoia, that the other side, so to speak, will use falsehoods, use bad sources of information to mislead the public. And it occurred to me to ask, is there any constructive way in which artificial intelligence might help either individuals or the government or campaigns to sift truth from falsehood, to help us focus on a set of common facts, perhaps about the performance of the economy, or perhaps about immigration trends, so that artificial intelligence might help us arrive at a common set of facts that everyone could agree on in a way that it seems like politics used to be based on that. Everybody agrees that the budget deficit is a problem. We disagree about how to solve it. Is there potential for that in the future?
Well, that would be an interesting question to put to some of the new AI tools. You can actually describe the problem exactly as you described it, that we live in an era that's highly polarized, facts are contested, people don't trust experts anymore. A lot of leaders are loose with the facts. How can we persuade people in that type of environment? Like, what are the kinds of messages that might move undecided voters? That would actually be an interesting test for AI to see if there are creative or out-of-the-box suggestions that would come out of that. I personally do not want to accept the idea that America is moving into a post truth world or a fact world. That is a terrible world. We all are going to be impoverished if that turns out to be the case. I don't think we should accept that as a conclusion. And I know there are lots of examples that actually kind of suggest that we're headed in that direction, but I still have faith in the American public. I think if you look at recent elections, the public actually has some capability to discern truth from falsehoods. Facts matter in the sense that, you know, when certain things happen, people respond based on that information. So I personally still think that facts matter, and individuals and organizations should act as if facts do matter, because if we reach the opposite conclusion, then none of the stuff that we're talking about is going to matter.
Yeah. A moment ago, we were talking about congressional efforts to regulate artificial intelligence in politics, state efforts to do the same. It prompted a really good question from the audience, which is there a way to regulate artificial intelligence in politics in a global fashion, considering that some of the sources of political messaging, whether they use artificial intelligence or not, some of the sources of political messaging might be coming from anywhere in the world, and certainly from outside the borders of the United States.
This is going to be a big problem in the 2024 election, because in the short run, there's no way to regulate foreign entities. Like Congress can pass whatever laws it wants, the state of Minnesota can pass whatever laws it wants. It's not going to affect any of the foreign entities who we already know are gearing up for major disinformation campaigns. One of the scary things about this election is the number of countries that have a major stake in the outcome of this election, and the number of countries that already have a preferred candidate. Like there are many countries such as, and I would put Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea in this category, but also possibly the Saudis, Qatar, UAE, possibly even Israel. Like their governments, many of them, not all of them, but many of them have a preferred candidate in the presidential election. And so the potential for mischief, given the large number of foreign entities that see this as an important election, like Putin hopes to win the Ukraine war, not on the battlefields of Ukraine, but in the 2024 American election. You know, if he can get candidates elected who want to cut off aid to Ukraine, Putin basically wins, or, you know, faces a much easier path going forward. So we're not going to be able to regulate what the foreign entities do. In the longer run, we actually do need to reach international agreements in the same way that with other technologies, we had treaties on various types of things. But obviously, that's not going to happen in the near future, and certainly not in time for the 2024 election.
Right. Another aspect of regulation, another question from our audience. We've spent the last several years in the United States, and especially in Europe, discussing and debating the responsibility of the big social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. Their responsibility to vet the messages coming across on their platforms, to be accountable for the truth or the falsity of what's being broadcast on their platforms. Someone in the audience tonight asked the same thing about the use of artificial intelligence, disinformation on those platforms. Can those platforms be held accountable for bad information the same way, for example, that a manufacturer might be held accountable for making false claims about their product? And I know this whole social media arena, it gets, the legal and First Amendment issues are complicated, but what do you make of their responsibility in this area?
Right now, there is little accountability on the part of social media companies for what happens on their platforms, because in 1996, when Congress passed the Communications Act, the internet was in its infancy at that time, and the Clinton administration and members of Congress basically said, you know, we don't want to run the risk of over-regulating this new technology. Let's see how it develops. And so they basically developed a libertarian stance where they delegated most of the major decisions to the tech companies. So it's now 25 years later, we can see the results of that. Like all of the problems that we see now basically arise from the fact that there's no accountability and very little regulation in the tech space. Now, that libertarian stance is coming to an end now. We are going to have legislation that passed. There's going to be guardrails that put in place kind of in the next 2, 3, and 4 years. So there will be more accountability, but there needs to be greater transparency about how these algorithms operate, what kind of data they use. Companies need to be held accountable for the results of those algorithms. So for example, if a bank is making lending decisions based on algorithms, and there is a disparate impact where women are getting fewer loans or African Americans are getting fewer loans, there needs to be accountability. Like in the non-digital world, when we see examples like that, like you can sue banks for engaging in behavior where there are demonstrated biases. We need to bring that same mentality into the digital space. There's a bunch of stuff that's illegal in the physical world that we need to make illegal in the digital world.
Right, right. One of the other concerns that cropped up in the last 2 or 3 election cycles was the effort to use election logistics as a tool to, for example, suppress voter turnout, for example, to mislead voters about where their polling place was, or mislead voters about the hours of their polling place. To mislead voters about their local elections officials, who was running the election and whether they were honest people. Do you imagine, or have you seen examples of artificial intelligence being used to target some of these logistical questions, to pick out certain polling places, for example, or certain election officials for political manipulation?
Well, in most states, it's actually illegal to try and deceive people about the election date or place. So if anybody in Minnesota sees examples of that, like, you should report them to the legal authorities, because that is not allowed. And I'm sure in Minnesota that is not legal. But the more difficult cases is there are states that are basically cutting back on the number of polling places in African American communities, knowing that those communities tend to vote Democratic, in an effort to keep that vote down, to change the registration rules or processes in ways that discourage certain types of people from voting. There are state legislators that are actually passing laws to make it more difficult to vote. And as a political scientist, I completely object to all those things, because I want people to vote. Like, that is what democracy is all about. The more people who vote, the happier I am on election day. And so those types of efforts aren't really an AI problem. And I doubt if there's going to be an AI solution, because we already know the states that are engaging in that behavior. Their state legislatures are trying to do that. You can file lawsuits, and in some cases, the courts actually have stood up for what I would view as democratic principles. In other cases, they have not. So the courts are kind of a mixed bag right now on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, great, thank you. Our hour is winding down, and so let me go to just one final question from the audience. It's a really interesting one, and one that gets at, as it were, the mechanics of campaigns and how the modern political campaign operates. And someone is asking, do you see artificial intelligence being used, or has it already been used, to target campaign spending in certain ways in certain areas, or to predict voting patterns and to predict outcomes in a way that would help a campaign?
I haven't seen it be used in ways like that that lead to accurate results. I think it's going to be hard to have algorithms that predict elections, just because we're kind of in an unusual time period where some historic patterns that tended to predict elections no longer seem to have the same predictive power that they might have had 5, 10, or 20 years ago. So I think that becomes a big challenge, both for humans as well as algorithms. But I do think in the campaign spending area, the tools are more egalitarian in the sense that, all of us worry about billionaire influence in elections and, people dropping tens of millions of dollars into particular gubernatorial races or House or Senate races in order to influence the outcome. With the new communications tools, anybody can actually communicate to other people. And so the monopoly that people with a large amount of money had is actually starting to be eroded by technology if people take advantage of these tools, which I encourage them to do. It's a way to kind of empower marginalized communities and low resource organizations to basically have very sophisticated communications tools at their fingertips. And so I'm not saying we're moving to an egalitarian America where money doesn't matter anymore, but some of these new technologies have the potential to help level the playing fields in ways that we definitely need to do.
Wow. Well, I love it that we can end on a hopeful note, and thank you for mentioning those constructive ways that we might find artificial intelligence being used in our politics. We've just about run out of time, and so in closing, I'd just like to say thanks. Thank you, Dr. West, for joining us tonight. This has been a really stimulating and informative hour. I want to thank again our co-sponsors, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause Minnesota, Fair Vote Minnesota, and the Minnesota Humanities Center. And especially a big thanks to all of you in the audience who spent an hour with us tonight. Please stay on the lookout for future education events sponsored by Clean Elections Minnesota. And thanks and good night.